Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right, everyone. Welcome to another session of the Dark Stoa. I see a lot of familiar faces. I see some new ones. So just a brief overview what this is all about. This is a weekly series where we explore some pretty heavy themes, and we basically practice Stoic practice of negative visualization, as Pat Ryan talks about where the world is headed and tends to be dark, hence the title. The structure is a talk from Pat Ryan and then followed by a Q&A period. So during the presentation, please make note of anything that seems strange to you, anything that you want clarification on, any way you want to challenge Pat. And in the Q&A, we'll have an opportunity to have some dialogue. You can put your questions in the chat, and I can ask them for you if you don't want to be on YouTube, because this is going to be recorded. This is a really interesting session. Throughout this whole series, we've had one question come up over and over and over again, which is, who exactly is Pat Ryan? And this is the week where we find out, because in this session, we're going to learn who Pat Ryan is, and we might even learn a little bit about who we are through that process. I'm very excited for this presentation. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Pat.
Hi, folks. Thank you again for the hosting, and thank you all for returning week after week for week number 12 at this point. It's been a pleasure to share what's in my mind on voice. I'm used to doing it either through memes, through sock puppets, or through text. And so the voice ability is a new domain that I didn't previously have access to. So I thank you all for listening. We've been going over season 1 regarding what the right side of that Cthulhu Pepe meme looks like and what it means for the progress of psychotechnology. This season, we've been going over the left side of that meme, which is about the flaws and the mistakes that the Blue Church has done to the point that it cannot be resolved. There's no clean way to actually get a proper path out of this. It's hit a level of complexity where, as a programmer, you just have to make the hard call and simply say, we gotta code it from scratch again. Sorry, it's just too much to keep track of. And in the process of going through all of this, I leave clues about myself every so often, but I'm not a fan of the messenger being important. I've seen what happens when the messenger is the star of the show. The ego goes to their head. I spent 14 years in Hollywood. I've seen it more times than I can count. I've always been interested in just telling the damn story and let the audience figure it out. But last week, part of the story did have to involve me. And so there was demonstration in understanding what it was that, why am I doing this? Why does this matter? I can tell you why the Blue Church is a problem. I can tell you why it's hitting all of us so hard. But why do I care? And, so we're going to explore that, how that process came to be. And I'm hopefully going to give you a different technique on how to explore your own origin stories. Well, I'd rather just show than tell you. So here we go. Let me get my laser pointer. Pew pew. I think I got my date right. Who am I? You may notice the link has changed. Yeah, click on it and find out. See what happens. Oh God, there's me being me. It's for the PR pieces. So who am I? Like, what is this about? Well, most of you may know that I managed to get Milo Yiannopoulos 20,000 followers on Twitter at a time when he came in support of this weird cultural thing called Gamergate that put him on Steve Bannon's radar. I have all the evidence of me doing that. I have all of the experiments of me leading up to that moment. I made them all public as I went along. This was a semi-coordinated process. It wasn't just a random stroke of luck. And at the end, you'll see the reasoning behind all of that. I helped a Google whistleblower not die when Google literally tried to kill him. So Zach Voorhees blew the whistle, and Google grabbed a whole bunch of information, about 900 pages of internal design documents and everything else. And he was going to run to New York alone to speak to Project Veritas, but I managed to convince him to say, "Hey, come to DC. I got a pile of contacts for you." As soon as that conversation was over, Zach posted a kill switch on Twitter, which Google was happy. A kill switch is the idea: if you do harm to me, then there will be consequences of this stuff leaking in places where you don't want it to leak. Google took that as a signal that perhaps there was a psychological issue going on here and decided to perform a wellness check on him, which involved a sniper, a helicopter, a bomb disposal unit, and armed police for a wellness check. Yeah, that's Google. I was on the phone with him as he was under duress of firearms from legally unaccountable sources, and we were able to de-escalate that tension and get him to DC a few hours later. I've been helping him ever since. Turned 4chan in my personal army many, many times. It's the greatest taboo of 4chan. It's not supposed to be a personal army, but I found a way to do it. So that's me. And I invented Butterfly War. And that's how a lot of you got to know me, because Jordan Hall made mention of Butterfly War in one of his situational assessments, considering it to be a clever way to change the nature of the conflict that's going on between the Blue Church and the Red Religion. And I did it entirely to fuck with the monopoly that Google has on psychographics. There's many ways to go after that monopoly. There's formal ways, there's cultural ways, there's legal ways. I've seen them all, and they all fail. So I decided to change the parameters of the engagement and say, well, let's go after your AIs instead. And I've been doing funny meme slides every week after week relentlessly here, which is where we're building our fun little relationship. And I give Peter and Daniel way too much shit because of my paranoia of social justice warriors. So if you can, thank Peter and Daniel as often as possible for putting up with me and eating the risk of bringing me here, because there is risk. This is not a risk-free chat. There's penalty for me doing all this stuff. There will be vendettas and everything else, and intimidation coming down my way. So give Peter and Daniel all the support that he needs, that they need, because they've been putting up with both ends of it. And I'll apologize for my end. I don't know what the other end will. What you don't know about me: I graduated high school with a 2.2 GPA. I hated homework. I loved history. I loved math. I wasn't bad at school. I was too busy running a website. I was running a music website off GeoCities. I was getting 400,000 downloads a month before the MP3 was invented. In fact, I got my first royalty check from ASCAP. Someone had downloaded it and used it on one of her albums, Princess Superstar, some no-name German rapper who worked with Cool Keith. I'm an old man saying these names, I know. But I was hustling hard on the internet. Like, my 2.2 GPA was because I had like I was straight stealing email addresses from AOL. So like AOL would come out with these chain mails, and they'd send like, "Oh, you got to forward this to 1,000 people that you know, or someone you love is going to die from an alligator," or something like that. And in every one of these emails, you'd have like all the places that email had been. So I learned like C++ just so I can write a scraper to grab all the email addresses. So I was just, every time a chain mail just like popped up in my mailbox, I was like, "Ooh, free email addresses." Grabbed them all. And then I wrote a script because eventually the chains stopped happening because spam protections came into play. And so I started making a script that would do an email exchange where I would compare my list with whatever emails you were submitting, and I would take 2 emails from you that I didn't have, and then I would give you one that you didn't have. It was some slimeball shit, but it totally worked. I was able to blow it up to like, I don't know, like 6,000 emails in 1998, and I was still in high school. So I was just bombing people with my music nonstop from that list alone. And that's how I was getting 400,000 downloads a month. It was fun stuff. I was so bad at it, AOL banned me for like months. I couldn't get the people who were raising me, they couldn't even get like an ISP account from anywhere because we were labeled as such heavy spammers. That was entirely my fault. But I had music. It wasn't even good music. I wasn't the best. I just happened to be one of the first. I never went to college. There's a reason for that, because I knew 3 programming languages, and then the .com bubble hit 1999 into 2000. So they weren't hiring programmers, and so I was a menial labor for like years, cleaning golf carts and doing landscaping. The reason I had to pivot there was because at the age of 17, I decided to be a father figure for someone else's child for 21 years. She's in California now. I moved her out there. But I met her when she was 18 months old, and I was the only dad that was ever going to be there. Word of advice, don't be the only white family in the projects. That's not a good investment under any circumstances, and they just happened to be that. So I was like, hey, I know what this is like. I lived in those situations before. I can give you some advice on how not to get stomped on the school bus every day. And that was 4 years. And so all my ambitions and dreams, I just happily put them aside. I shouldn't have been so happy about putting them aside. I should have gave it a little bit more thought looking back. But I put it aside so I could, just like take care of this urgent situation. And I did for 4 years. And then I said, I'm going to go to LA, I'm going to make my money, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to improve your lot in life. And it took me 5 years, and that's exactly what I did. So that was a big reason I didn't go to college. I think the GPA being so low was another one. But I always like telling the story because it's 100% true. So the projects in this place in the Ocean City, New Jersey, it wasn't like, I don't know, it wasn't like Chicago projects or anything like that, but it was serious low income housing and high crime and robberies at the corner store at least once every month. Everybody was on some degree of government assistance there. They worked it. They had families working it together. They would intentionally kick people out so they can move their family in. I mean, it's some real dastardly shit. And across the street from us was extremely low income housing. And you had like this like shack. It was the worst house in the block if it even qualified as a house. It looked like just a repurposed tool shed. And in that repurposed tool shed was like 5 Mexicans, probably illegal immigrants. And they were working like a tiny corporation. They were like, one was the fisher, one was the landscaper, one was the interior painter, one was the construction worker, and one was something else. And they would work as a like this highly efficient, organized team where they would cut every cost imaginable. The dude was fishing for food off the bridge to get so they didn't have to pay for the food. They can get it straight from the ocean all the time. They were rotating and just working and grinding while everyone in the projects was just sitting there fucking off, myself included. And within about a year, they got all their shit together. They pulled up enough money that they bought a rundown house down the block. It's a rundown Victorian. Maybe they bought it for 120 or whatever. It was right before like the real estate took off before the boom, before the bubble bust in 99. And they had taken all of their collective skills to get the house refurbished. So they did the landscaping, they redid the exterior, they redid the interior, they fixed up all the holes, they flipped the house from $100,000 to like $800,000. And we watched, like the entire community watched this whole process over a 1.5-year span period. And I just sat there, I'm like, what the fuck am I doing with my life? Like this, I need to get my act together. We literally watched this happen. Like nobody stopped them, but nobody helped them either, for what it's worth. After seeing that, I decided to, get my stuff together. So I spent 14 years in Hollywood for the sole purpose of destroying it. I came there for the money, but I had my ulterior motives. I wanted to make sure that the engine that was responsible for everything that I had gone through and was responsible for the position that my daughter was in, I wanted that engine destroyed. And I'm about to get my wish. It's not even a wish, it was hard work. It didn't happen on its own. I had to help where I could. And we'll get into how I can make the leap from all this stuff that I was telling you here. And I know that's a bit jarring, but we'll be able to explain my reasoning here in a couple slides. I had the joy of experiencing the full spectrum of the human condition before the age of 10. The very good, the very bad, the very demented, the very angelic, all of it. There, people talk about human potential with tabula rasa. They say, "Oh, tabula rasa, you can be anything you want." It's always said in a positive tone. Yeah, I could be a CEO. I could be this. Well, it's also true in the negative. You could be a complete scumbag. You can be a mass murderer. You could be an arsonist. That's very true about tabula rasa. It goes either way. You have the freedom to pick what it is you want to be. And more often than not, people pick what they're psychologically used to, what they've been psychologically conditioned to. So is it really a free slate? Is it really an open book? I had experienced the whole thing, every book possible. There isn't an abuse you can name that I didn't go through. What you really don't know about me, my time in Hollywood. I was attractive once upon a time, and powerful women in Hollywood seem to like that, exhibit A. And I got to know quite a few of them, including, extended families and royal families and these type of things, and I got to know them. And I also trained less powerful women to investigate scenarios of power they didn't know they were a part of. I was raised by women my entire life. I understand the female psychology almost as good as a male possibly could ever have, and there's still a lot that I don't know. But I get more than I let on to about that type of thing. And there were girls in Hollywood who were in some wild scenarios. They were running from abusive situations. They were in abusive situations. Van Nuys is the porn capital. Those girls didn't go there because they liked to, have sex. They went there because most of them were traumatized as children. And they were traumatized as children because of mass media. And I will squarely put the blame on that. And I'll be able to explain my reasoning again later on. There was one who was really in a hell of a situation and she didn't realize it. She was the daughter of someone extremely powerful and she didn't even know it. And she went through some very abusive stuff with her cousin, and I helped her understand as best I could, but you can't, it's so hard. It's not like I'm out here trying to fix people. I mean, it's not the point. Her father was very influential and very experienced geopolitically important science stuff. And I was able to learn quite a few things from that scenario about what is and what was not possible, who was funding, who was not funding. So I'm collecting information. Not that I'm using women to collect information per se, because they're using me as much as I'm using them, because we're all young and we're stupid and that's what we do. I would also pay bums to dig through dumpsters, Hollywood restaurants. There was a period in time in which Hollywood restaurants were just printing receipts with the full fucking credit card number on it, expiration date and the special code. Print that's right there. I was like, bro, are you serious? Like, do none of you have FinCEN on speed dial? Like, what the fuck? I would pay the bums like $20. Like, yeah, just, dig through Pig and Whistle. Just go get all the receipts. You'll get celebrities. You get celebrities, you get their agents, you get their hookers, you get their prostitutes, you get everything. Because once you got the credit card number, I know all your transactions. I got you. That got me to working with Lee Stranahan, who's Steve Bannon's top investigative journalist. Lee Stranahan has his own radio show, paid entirely for by the Russians, which is going to speculate all kinds of fun little connections there, I'm sure. I don't have Russian friends. So yeah, that's what you really don't know about me. So how, what am I even pressing here? What was I thinking? The point is, like, there's a lot I don't tell people, which is why I don't like making me the center point here. I like making the message important, because the message is like this compression of my journeys. If I sat there and explained all of my journeys one thing at a time, you would cross so many gamuts of emotional exploration, you wouldn't even know how to process it. So the stories I'm telling and the fables I'm giving over these many weeks, that's the result of my journeys. My journeys are compressed in there, and they're being shaped in a way so that when they're handed to you, you can digest it and extract from it what you want. Instead of me saying, this is what I went through and you need to do the same. My daughter's 21. I can tell you how much that doesn't work. Let me tell you stories instead. So how did this happen? How did I become this way? Well, there's a lot of explanations on that. Some people will use drugs. Some people will say my childhood. They'll look at pop psychology. They'll use sociology. There's an infinite number of neuromyths that people can subscribe to and say, well, I'm this way because neuromyth X, Y, Z. And maybe there's kernels of truth in that. I personally see everything as a story. I think science is a story, to be honest, at this point. So I see everything as a story. And as long as you're willing to admit that we're story creating and story receiving creatures at some part of us, that maybe it's worth looking at your life as if it was a story. And so I'm going to tell you the story of the pressures that shaped me to become what I am. And it's going to involve factors that most of you may find beneficial if you were to emulate this practice on your own as well. I'm going to start with the geopolitical pressures that made my parents complete monsters. We're going to start with Adolphin Hortler, because why not? I can't go a slide without mentioning this damn fish. So he decided that blowing up Europe was hilarious. And the Europeans were like, this sucks. And Germans were like, what problem, bro? And the world was like, you should calm that fish down. And the problem with blowing up Europe is that Europe was able to take all the gold from Egypt and the Levant and Persia and Turkey and this part of the world and this part of the world and a little bit of this part of the world. So it managed to, and also the gold like from all of here too, and all of it from here too. So it got a lot of gold. In fact, it got around 6,000 tons of gold. It accumulated it since Alexander the Great. Between Alexander the Great and World War II, 6,000 tons of gold. Adolphin Hortler comes in and says, fuck you. He flails around with his fins. And the Europeans say, we got to get our gold out of here because if the fish takes it, we're pretty much screwed. So we got to put our gold in the only place that's safe, and that's America, because the fish can't get there. So all the Europeans, with the exception of maybe the Swiss they're a funny lot. Most of Europe decided to ship all of their gold to the bedrock of Manhattan, right underneath the J.P. Chase building in downtown Manhattan. About 6,000 tons, just a couple thousand feet below. Right where the World Trade Center towers collapsed. How odd. So, the Europeans blow themselves up. They say, got to protect the gold, not our people. What's more classically European? And then the war ends. The fish is gone, and the Americans are doing their thing. And thanks for transferring all your gold to Europe, you complete idiots. It's been real nice dealing with you. Now the war ends, and the French are like, the war's over. You can give us our gold back. I think they sent 2 destroyers. France has opinions. That's very cute. We did not give that gold back. That gold remained there, period. You can't trust Europe with it anymore. And it's been that way ever since. The French hate America ever since that. Despite them helping the foundation of our country and us assisting them in World War II. We didn't give them their gold back, so yeah, they hate us. What do we do with that gold? Well, we didn't give it back to them. We didn't give it back to Europe. What we said instead, we said, hey, let's give you something that's just as good to calm your nerves. We're going to say that our dollar is equivalent to the gold we took from you. So we will give you all of your gold back in the version of our dollars, which we will then respect and honor and trade as if it was your gold. But you're a little unstable right now because the Russians are right there and there's nukes everywhere. And we don't know if giving back all your gold is actually the best thing at this time because it's still pretty unstable. So we'll just hold it and we'll give you these certificates instead. And the Europeans grudgingly agreed. And the Americans were like, yes, yes, suckers, got you, bitch. They did the Dave Chappelle. So what did that mean? What did that look like? So Detroit was the heart of the steel cycle. Now, we've gone over the steel cycle before, and I think season 1, I think it was, where you build all the steel, you build everything of steel, you run out of things to build with steel, so you use steel to blow up all the steel that you built, so you can then rebuild more steel. That's a steel cycle. It's an insane, this is the insane asylum that J.P. Morgan and Ford put us on. And we got all of Europe's gold because of that. So good us. Now, so the Europeans blew themselves up. We have all their gold. We're giving them their gold back in the form of US dollars. And what are we doing with that? Well, we are producing all of the goods that Europe needs to build itself back up. This is the Pax Americana of the 1950s. Our economy was so stellar back then because we were literally rebuilding an entire nation that had no choice but to buy all of our exports. All of them. So Detroit makes its good capital goods. Pennsylvania steel is kind of petering out because of World War II, but there's other steels around. There's manufacturing being done all across here, and all of it leads to the Eastern Seaboard. Because the Eastern Seaboard is the docking area in which all of those goods get shipped out. So as long as steel production is demanded here, this part of the world does good, this part of the world does equally good. These two are interconnected. They are joined at the economic hip. And what does it look like? Well, end of the war, all the way through the 1950s. Look at that unemployment, barely breaking 4%. In fact, as the Marshall Plan continues, it evolves furthermore. We start breaking into a little bit more wars in Korea and then Vietnam and that type of stuff. We're still exporting all of our goods all over the place. We have the lowest unemployment imaginable. And then skyrockets. We'll get to the skyrocket in a moment. And Europe is the primary consumer of steel cycle goods. This was some of the propaganda that was used to push the Marshall Plan. So then that happens. Why did that happen? How did that happen? Well, the Saudi Arabians decided to throw a temper tantrum. They said, hey, you're backing Israel, so we're going to suspend your oil. We're going to cut off your oil. Now, some of y'all might be old enough to remember having to stay in lines to get oil, perhaps when you were children, during this time. And that was a result of us, because we have pivoted our entire economy into war manufacturing so much that we saw ourselves as invincible. We could go to any country and just blow stuff up and whatever. We got all the bombs, we got the nukes, fuck you. And that worked for a little bit. And then we got checked real hard at this point, because you're not moving a tank or a bomber without oil. It's just not going to happen. So if Saudi Arabia says no more oil for you, it doesn't matter how much steel you're producing. You can't even leave the goddamn shores with it. So you're screwed. And we got checked. We got chin checked real hard here. And then unemployment. And that's when I was born, when all the shit broke. And if anybody else is born in the 80s and around this time, you were also born when all the shit broke. Now, where you were born really mattered. I happen to be born here. So if the steel is not being demanded anymore, then this part of the world dies too. So I was born into a dying civilization. And I watched it every single day. Marshall Plan would become the Mutual Security Agency to extend its life at around $7 billion annuum for 10 years, which would then later become the world's most notorious black budget piggy bank, USAID, which is still running to this day at 27 billion strong. You're going to see a level of fuckery you can't even comprehend. Dig up these guys. Okay, so what else is going on? Like, hold on, I got a backstep here. Saudi Arabians intervene and really screw stuff up. But they were the tip of the iceberg. There was another force at play here too. So Henry Ford II comes along. He becomes president of Ford Motor Company. This is Detroit. And at that time, Ford's business model was good. They had been strong since the 1920s. And the entire world was demanding their product because the Europeans blew themselves up. Ford was able to export to all these places that were also modernizing at the same time. So business was getting good. But there were inefficiencies. And so what Ford did is he hired what's called the whiz kids, which are a bunch of US Air Force officers who were really skilled in sophisticated logistics management, which you need for a war. So if you're running like an Eisenhowerian World War II effort, you need significant logistics talent and training and distribution and all these types of things. And the Army is, if there's anything they like, You can joke about jarheads all day long, but nobody, absolutely nobody, beats the US military in terms of logistics planning. They are brilliant. That's the number one strength of the US military. It's not the fact that we have nukes or we have really good tech. It's the fact that we can take anything we want and put it in front of you 72 hours later after the decision is made. No other country can do that. And you can only do that with logistics superiority, which we have in abundance and will remain to have in abundance. So Henry Ford decides to use it. The second decides to use it. Now, what does that look like? What does it mean when you streamline one of the world's most profitable companies in history at that time? Well, back to our little America model. You need to identify cheap labor. And you need to identify ways to make that cheap labor work in your really complicated factory that's producing automobiles. We tend to see cars everywhere and we hate traffic jams all day long. But don't think that cars grow on trees. Cars are really hard to make. Quite literally a lot of moving parts. Complicated engines, complicated air systems, electronics out the ass. It's a lot of stuff you got to do. And there's a lot of places you can screw that up. So you got to get really finely tuned manufacturing lines. And you want to make sure that you have the cheapest labor that you can possibly have access to running those lines. Now, the computer was just getting started. The computer was actually being implemented at these factories to reduce the amount of artisanal skill you needed and increase the amount of errors you could make without destroying the final product. So now you can actually make cars that are more advanced and reduce the intelligence and reduce the skill and reduce the wages of all the workers that you need to make the cars. So what you're doing is you're setting a criteria. Where can I find the cheapest labor who isn't educated, who's barely literate? Where can I find them in America? Well, Jim Crow laws. So Ford begins to target the African American community in the South. He says, come on up to Detroit. It's going to be good. So what do? They bring the blues with them. They bring their hands. They bring their families. They bring their feet. They bring their time. They bring their soul food. They bring good old-fashioned American race riots. They're all over Detroit. In fact, that's where you get Motown from. Motor Town, Motor City, Detroit. Yeah, Ford was able to bring the cheapest labor that America had into its cities to run its factories. Of course, Beehive lady over there is happy with this arrangement. But what happens? Well, for starters, the blacks enter a middle-class existence as a whole for the first time and possibly only time in American history. It's a huge boom, huge boom. Because if you know anything about the economic history of South of America and slavery, it's not just the horrors of slavery. There's actual like contention between unions and slaves throughout most of American history. Unions did not want slaves in their territories because they would undercut their arrangements. So if a union worker was making the equivalent of $15 an hour, you bring in a slave, guess what? You don't need that union worker. So a lot of the fight there was actually price metrics too in the Civil War period. They had proto unions back then, and they didn't want to bring in slaves to fuck up that arrangement. So get out of here. That's what a lot of the race riots were actually about. But they bust through it. They find the cheapest labor. They put them in Detroit, and Detroit is like it's like Black Renaissance. It's like Harlem Renaissance going on over there. They're building record labels, they're building law firms, they're building logistics, they're learning finance, they're actually getting a chunk of the American pie for the first time in a meaningful way. But unfortunately, the thing about making these factories so easy that you can bring the cheapest labor you have in your system into it is that there's other cheaper labor somewhere else. That's the cheapest labor you could access right now. What about cheap labor over the seas? What about cheap labor somewhere else? Well, it turns out Mao Zedong decided to social justice his country so damn hard that his complicated workforce would only work for bowls of rice. And that's as cheap labor as you can possibly find. You can't get cheaper than that. And it's massive. It's about, at the time, 600 million. So 600 million people effectively stuck in the Iron Age had just had their entire society gutted from the inside out by themselves to the point that anybody who went through the Cultural Revolution to this day does not talk about it. That's the level of heinous crimes that they were doing to each other. They were throwing their teachers in the streets. They were lighting them on fire. They were having kids kill their parents. It was a total mess. And if you want to see the shit show that is, you're not allowed to call out communism in America. It's the great dream. But if you want to see what the Chinese were doing with it, I highly recommend it. In the end, it ultimately resulted in making all of their people the cheapest labor in the world. And once you start playing that game, well, that's when you attract the predators. Oh, look at that. It's our pal, Henry Kissinger. He wants to have a chat with Mao. Say, hey, see, you got all that cheap labor. So what do you want for it? Ford's like, yeah, y'all should talk. Meanwhile, looks like Black America's on the chopping block because they're going to take all those factory jobs away. They're going to take all that opportunity away, and they're going to give it to the Chinese because that's the cheapest labor. It's not even malicious. It's just price discovery. There's victims along the way. There's collateral damage along the way. That's the world, man. I don't know. So what happens? Kissinger and Mao strike their arrangement. Then poof, China becomes manufacturing gods of the world. All those factories move out. People don't have jobs. They're not doing the things. They didn't go to college because they didn't have to, because the factory job was sitting there just waiting for them to feed their family. So why even bother investing in complicated college? There's no point until there was. And then you see the great switch over time. I mean, this is a 2000, this is a 2000 metrics. This dates all the way back to the 70s. Really ramps up here, where China starts becoming much greater share of manufacturing output, and America goes down. And even then, this is a false number. This number is, so you have to understand volume. Like when you go from 8% to 24%, China's manufacturing was doing cheap shit. So they were exporting huge amounts of cheap electronics that is a huge part of keeping their populations employed. The Americans were, while they've gone down in export overall, the reason why they haven't gone down in an astronomical way, which they should have, was that we started exporting complicated, expensive goods. So like F-16s and capital goods and Caterpillar and stuff like that. So to offset, for the sake of capital investment, the loss of manufacturing opportunity we just started producing more complicated shit to settle the difference because it's more expensive, so we could sell it at a higher price tag. Meanwhile, our factory base is just gutted, utterly gutted, and the dependency tributary, the rail line tributary that connects to that manufacturing base all over the East Coast is also gutted as well. So globalism destroys us, the East Coast, I should say, destroys the East Coast. So this is Philadelphia, and this is Newark, New Jersey. This is Paterson, New Jersey. This is when manufacturing was being shipped during the Marshall Plan. Yeah, it's a snippet. I get it. I'm playing emotional here, but I'm trying to drive a point because I lived through this shit. And then poof, unemployment goes up. What does unemployment do? Well, we're taking all your factory jobs and we're taking all your social stability. We're going to gut the black middle class. They're going to get understandably pissed about that. And white people are going to fucking bounce because they do not want to sit there during the fires and the riots and the murders and all that type of shit. So they just, boop, they dip. And upon doing so, you're left without a tax base. And that tax-based destruction is not easy to undo. Gentrification is only a recent concept. I don't know if y'all remember New York in the 70s, it was a fucking mess. In fact, all these cities were a mess. In fact, that's what they are at today. I will take you to where I grew up in Philadelphia. It will look like this. And it looked like that when I was growing up there. And Newark is like this. Paterson's like this. Newark was reigning champion of cannibalism in America in 2006. Highest rates of cannibalism. I lived here. I grew up in this shit. So globalism becomes the dehumanization pipeline that we've lovingly called progress. Philly, you had 3 murders a day where I was growing up. 3 murders per day every 24 hours, 3 dead people. You had the destruction of labor unions, which means families did not have the ability to pay for their children's education, their well-being. They didn't have the ability to pay their bills. That is going to add psychological distraught, which is going to make the families crack up, resort to drug use and alcoholism and all the fun little diversions and chemical nonsense we do to ourselves, except in this case, they do it all together at the same time. We become the most over-medicated generation in US history as a result of that. 20% of my generation was aborted. They'll never tell you those numbers because the opportunities were stolen from them. It's not that women decided to be free one day. It's like, oh my God, we're free now. That's the neuromyth. The fact is, those women couldn't afford children. They couldn't afford having families. And so they wrapped it up in a neuromyth to make it feel like it was your idea. You destroyed your labor unions. You could no longer afford a family, so you got to kill them. That's it. And you have the Malthusians becoming popular once again. Literally endless exposure to anti-white propaganda. Boy, I got stories I could tell you since I was 13. Oh my God. I don't feel like getting into them because it just make my blood boil. But imagine being subjected from every, well, there's a slide dedicated to that. We'll get into that. Because it's actually not anti-white. It's another factor that's going on. It just presents as such. Greed as catharsis. There's a whole movie about that. Gordon Gekko, that fun little icon of the 80s, all the cocaine and fun times of the 80s. You're gonna solve your problem. You ever seen Wolf of Wall Street? It's like, your girlfriend doesn't respect you. Good, pick up the phone and dial, right? That kind of stuff. And child predators are on the rise. They tried to call this a moral panic in the 80s, but the numbers don't lie. Sustained systemic unemployment, we've seen the numbers. We've seen what it looks like. Mass normalization of pornography as well, which is changing how people look at each other and changing what they select for in their behavior. So all of these things become the pressures that shape me. And I am not alone. It shaped a lot of you too. It's just you haven't done the inventory on how this shaping looks and why it was driven to begin with. You haven't found the fundamental. And hopefully I'm trying to point to what happened. So here I am, surrounded by a bunch of feral subhumans that just can't figure out that their entire future was yanked from them. And I'm interested in finding ways to figure out their behavior so I can prevent them from hurting me more. That seems like a rational thing a person would do when they're surrounded by, oh, I don't know, the equivalent of ex-cons. And so I'm really interested in understanding their patterns so I could avoid that stuff and be like, hey, let's not, piss off that guy who's drunk all the time and beats his wife. Let's try and figure out why he beats his wife so then you can avoid it. We're going to introduce and pivot hard to a guy named Karl Marx. Karl Marx, you've heard everything about Karl Marx. It's probably mostly false. Karl Marx had an idea. He had a couple contributions that were pretty good because it turns out he was under the same pressures, although for different reasons. He was trying to figure out why humans do what they do. So he decided to look into economics, which was a rather novel way of looking at things. And this is an extension of the Scottish Enlightenment. You have Hume and you have the classic liberals and the libertarian types looking at this and saying, well, how do we create a harmonious society steering economics alone as the metric? Because we've seen what happens when the numbers don't line up, when the debts get out of sync and the obligations go out of whack. So we should probably get that lined up if we're interested in creating a society that doesn't slaughter itself all the time. Which was really important in Scotland in the 1600s because I think their number one export was stabbing each other. So you probably want to make sure you want to identify what the hell's going on here. Marx comes along, and I'll dedicate a whole slide to this, but there are a whole bunch of people who read them and they get it wrong. I'm not out here saying I got Marx right. I'm just saying a lot of people got it wrong. And while they're playing Marxist fan fiction for the rest of history, there were a couple people who developed his work in isolation, who ended up contributing more than anyone since Marx. That's a guy named Antonio Gramsci. Now, Gramsci he was an Italian Marxist. And while the rest of the Marxists were sitting there measuring each other's PP length, trying to attract the most proletariats to their cause, he was stuck in prison for 9 years. So he was isolated from that game entirely. He was not part of the social media, like my Revolution blog type of shit. Because he was in prison for 9 years, he was allowed to develop his theories in isolation and in independence. So he was not pressured by the remainder of the Marxist groups to conform to their way of thinking about revolutionary theory. He was able to develop something very novel. Now, the thing about the Marxists, later Marx would get into this, early Marx did not. Marx was very concerned about the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and their fetishization and virtualization of all these commodities and stuff, the conspicuous consumption, he called it. As a result, one of the more electric attractors of Marx was directing the hatred of the middle class into a Marxist fist. And as a result, they were dismissing culture entirely. They said culture doesn't matter. It's a byproduct of the bourgeoisie. Culture doesn't matter. It's a byproduct of conspicuous consumption. So we don't need to actually talk about culture because we can dismiss it as an artifact of our theory. Gramsci said the literal fucking opposite. He said, no, culture matters. In fact, it's the only thing that matters. You cannot have a Marxist revolution without taking the culture. Cannot do it. Impossible. So later on, this guy would come along, Rudy Duschke, I don't know, I read for a living. He comes up with a concept called the long march through the institutions of power, to create radical change from within government and society by becoming an integral part of the machinery. That's never been done in Marxist history, and not a lot of people subscribe to it. They were still trying to look at Marxian theory in nationalist tones. So they were looking at China, they were looking at Russia. They were saying, well, that's where the Marxism is. It's in those nations. And Rudy was saying, well, no, because if those nations collapse, then what the fuck? Like, the Marxism still has to exist. And so you actually have to infiltrate and play alongside of and get chummy with and get buddy-buddy with the people that you want to take down. And that's what he was promoting. So let's look at the FBI. Suddenly, they can't handle drug cartels. That drug war has been going on for 20 years, and they just can't clean them up. That's a weird thing. Strangest thing. Got our teachers telling us math is imperialism. That's curious. How did that happen? Directors are, you want to be the cool rebel, man. Fight the Death Star, fight the Empire, right? High finance, open borders mean more money. Keep the trade going. Woo! We don't have responsibility. We can defer the responsibility. And then you have computer tech somehow saying, we're the good corporation in this fight. We're Apple, and we care about you. All of this is the manifestation of the long march through the institutions of power. So here I am trying to figure out the subhumans. And I started here, which is why I'm even bringing this up. I started with Marx, I started there, but the world was here. So I looked at this and I said, okay, this guy's explaining something interesting about economics, possibly driving a lot of the crazy shit that I'm seeing. But it turns out all these things were already compromised waiting. So I was forced to see the Marxist perspective while thinking I arrived at it independently. So I was a Marxist for a good chunk of my life because I wanted to explain the feral subhumans who were beating the shit out of me. So let's delve into Marxism properly and really get down to the essence of what actually happened here. There's 2 books of note. You have The Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which is a fucking fascinating read. I recommend it. It is a great, great reference point because there are concepts in economics that are still used today that come from that book. The concept of inflation is perfectly described in that book. And in fact, that book becomes the foundation of his seminal work, Das Kapital. And then you have the Capitalist Manifesto. That should be the Communist Manifesto. I should learn to read. The Communist Manifesto is just trash, utter trash, garbage. Don't even bother believing it. It's just a puff piece. It attracts these types of people. It's like these hipsters who are just like, I'm in part of the revolution, man. If we just get communism, the grinder recommendation engine is going to be better. Like, get the fuck out of here. Like, bro, shut up. Like, if you read these things, you'll see what's going on here. Like, the reason I focus on critique of political economy is very straightforward. These 2 passages alone get to the heart of what Marx was talking about. He's talking about gold has to be money in the sense that it has to constantly change from one form to the other. Meaning, if I'm using money to represent my obligation to you, I need the ability to change it to match your needs. So if I'm Dutch and I have trades with Germany, I have to change my currency. It has to either be cash, it has to be credit, it has to be bullion, it has to be an obligation, it has to be a debt. I have to have the freedom to constantly change my value representation in the contracts that I'm dealing with. Now, gold is good for that because early on, gold could physically change shape. In more primitive societies, it was a very malleable metal, easy to change, and it would not rust, which is a really important part of that. So you can actually take a little bit of gold and bang a coin on it. And you can put like, I don't know, a little seal on it too at the same time so people can't, counterfeit it. And so that's like the gold actually serves a literal function in the Bronze Age, and all of civilization was built on these gold trades. So Marx is basically saying gold is an important part of our system. That's it. That's Marxism. And then he says, and here's my critique. And he follows up with, here's my critique. So all he did, he found a disequilibrium with the gold standard. That's all he did. That's literally all he did. Admittedly, it's a monumental task, as you're about to find out in the next slide. It takes a lot of fucking research. So if you go to my old site, getmedia.com, it points to this passage. There's a reason I left it there for years, because I knew these communist weirdos would come back in some manner, and I wanted them to stumble upon this later on. So I'm just going to read this straight up. We have seen that gold and silver cannot comply with the demand that as money, they should have an invariable value, meaning gold has to be a solid value over time in order for it to be worthwhile, meaning we cannot change the value of it or it ruins the contracts we promise to be a part of. So it has to hold its value. If I strike a contract with you that's 10 years long, we're going to do that contract paid in gold. If the price of the gold changes during those 10 years, we're in a world of problems because that's screwing up my expectations. Now I might be short, or you might be short, and now I gotta what the hell? So no, gold has to hold its position or we're gonna have problems. The value is nevertheless more stable than that of other commodities on the average, even as Aristotle noted, meaning the idea that gold could not be invariable was pragmatically incorrect. Gold did change value over time. It did change ratio over time. Apart from the general effect of an appreciation or depreciation of the precious metals, variation in the relative value of gold and silver are of particular importance since both are used side by side as a monetary material of the world market. All trade is conducted in gold at that time because the nations don't trust each other's currency. I don't trust English currency if I'm French. The Americans don't trust Japanese currency if they're Japanese. The Chinese aren't trusting Iranian currency, but we can all trust gold because nobody's manufacturing that. Nobody's just printing gold up out of nowhere. So we're using this thing. And purely economic reasons of such changes in value, conquests, and other political upheavals which exerted a substantial influence on the value of metals in antiquity have merely a local and temporary effect. These must be attributed to changes in the labor time required for the production of these metals. So the idea that where I can just rob you, I can invade you, take all your gold and bring it back to me, that kind of spikes my, it temporarily depreciates the value of the gold I have that already in my system because there's more of it. But that actually restabilizes over time. Take the Islamic conquest of Muhammad in the 1600s, 600s. So he's spreading this religious zealot force is consuming North Africa and the Middle East. And every time he's successful in his conquests, he unlocks gold from antiquity that was just sitting in these stores. So he unlocks the gold and now he's injecting it into his economy. It seems like he's getting richer, but the problem is by adding more gold into his economy, he's inflating the value of gold. So now his soldiers cost more money to travel more terrain. So the more successful his conquest is, the more expensive his soldiers become. And that's what actually stops him. It gets to a point where he cannot afford more soldiers because he's unlocked so much gold. But then that slowly changes back in time. It equilibriums because all that money, it checks itself. It floods up to the Venetians. It floods out. It floods out to the Silk Road. It naturally restabilizes. It naturally rebalances to the human condition traditionally. But the labor time changes. The labor time itself will depend on the relative scarcity of natural deposits and the difficulties involved in producing them in a purely metallic state. Now, why was he saying this? Why was he saying that the scarcity mattered? And why was he saying that the labor time itself was a result of that? This is where he based his entire absolute theory of labor on, by the way. This is the heart of his entire argument. The ratio of gold to silver in ancient Asia was 6-1, and this is the level of research he had to do, or 8-1. The latter ratio was prevalent in Japan and China, even in the early 19th century, 10-1. The ratio obtaining in Xenophon's time can be regarded as the average ratio in the middle period of antiquity. Working on the Spanish silver mines by Carthage and later by Rome exerted a rather similar influence on the ancient world to that of the discovery of the South American mines in modern Europe in the 1500s. During the era of the Roman emperors, 15 or 16-1 can be taken as the rough average, although the value of silver in Rome often sank even lower. And that's entirely because of, I forget the emperor's name for that one. During the following period, reaching the Middle Ages to modern times, a similar movement, which began with the relative depreciation of gold and ends with the fall in the value of silver, takes place. You see that with the rise of, who's that one king? Damn it, I forgot his name. It's not, it begins with a C. It's not Constantine, it's the other one. Anyway, because of the Muslim expansion, they had robbed so much gold from the economy, the Europeans had switched over to silver because there was no gold left. The Islamists had taken everything. The average ratio in the Middle Ages was 10-1. And the result of discovery of the mines of America, the ratio once again became 15-1. And the discovery of gold in Australia, California, and Colombia will probably lead to another fall in the value of gold, which is true, it did happen. So what he's talking about is the means in which all the standards that people are basing all of their trades upon, you can't use it. You can't do it. You cannot use gold because it is too volatile. It has a mythology of involatility, and for most of history, that was true. But once all the gold got locked up and artificial scarcity became a thing and the labor time of extraction changed, now gold was whoop, 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 whoop. And people were speculating on that, and it was destabilizing entire nations. So this is what Marx actually did. They don't tell you this. The academics won't tell you this. They'll try to they'll ladder you into it. They'll say, oh, well, it's the white people did this and you got to hate them now. And they'll leave gold to until you're 20 years into it. You have to complete a master thesis on Marxism before you even get to oh, by the way, he just, he figured out gold. And that's all he did. So the rest of it is just this step ladder of propaganda just so you can actually digest the gold thing. It's so silly. It's so absolutely nuts. Why does this matter? Why am I on this rant, right? Well, I was a Marxist. I was trying to describe the feral monsters. And once I read this passage, it made a ton of sense. Oh, if you can just figure out the demand between the value, the store of value, then everything else equalizes. So if a place didn't have stores of value, they would descend into chaos, and places with stores of value would be fine. It's a very simple equation. So I use that to explain the monsters in my life. Now you understand why the angry dolphin was so important. Because he moved all the gold to America. And after all, that's what Marx was asking for. He wanted a central bank. He wanted central control of inventory of gold. He wanted to make sure that it could be accounted for so that you can get rid of these imbalances. And that's kind of what happened with the formation of the American empire, or at least the modern one. Again, things they don't tell you in history. So going back to the weird bourgeois, the bourgeoisie, and why they pick what they pick. This is a hack of a 4chan meme. Kaylee, my target, you are a comrade now. You must click on our next BuzzFeed article. Will you click on the Pareto Frontier research about money cartels, or are you going to click on this fabulously gay Muslim? Poor Kaylee, right? Sorry. So why this stuff? What am I jumping a shark here? How does any of this make sense? I was confused. I had no idea. This was supposed to be the Great Marxist Revolution. It was 2008, Zuccotti Park. They were out there. They were ready to just bash some bankers and throw them out of buildings. And I was just like, well, just get good video footage of it. It was inevitable. They screwed up our economy. But they decided, nah, we got to go, we got to gay up Islam. That's important. That's the thing to do. We're going to do that. It's like, wait, what? Like, okay, maybe I can like reverse engineer it and say, if you do an intentional attack on gender relations in the Islamic empires, you can destabilize oil, right? Maybe some convoluted shit like that. Maybe that's how you get it to the Pareto frontier. But no, they decided to play identity politics instead. And I was like, guys, we are literally at the point where we can throw these guys out of buildings and get away with it. Why are you fucking picking this road? This road is the wrong road. Like, just throw Goldman Sachs execs off the fucking rooftop and we'll be fine in like 3 years. Nope. They wanted to play identity politics. They haven't stopped ever since. Of course, if you call them out on that, you say Marxism no longer has predictive power. Is nothing more than a very niche conflict theory. Well, and you forget that we're the most over-medicated generation in history when you say that. Well, you get the over-medicated coming after you. It's racist. It's her turn. You're not allowed to criticize Marx. They chased all of us out the movement. All of us. It was their turn. It was the psychotics' turn. Needless to say, I did not have a good taste of Marxism after that. I saw that it had been completely hijacked and it was pointless and it was no longer descriptive. So I decided to expand my horizon. Where did I go wrong? I probably went wrong in a lot of places. So I just threw it all off the table and decided, well, let's just start at random. I came across 3 books, one of which I wrote and never released. Dune, Shoulder of Giants, and The Empath. So let's go over these books and why they're important, why they're a good salve for when Marxism fails to be predictive. 1, Dune represented the complete dance of power as its own actor. So power as an actor of a story. It's not power as a byproduct of a story. It's not power as the story. It is an actor within it. And he went as full spectrum as he could to go acknowledge the actual human condition as it was, not as it should be, not what he thought the human condition should be, taking it as it worked, including outside of science, using theology, using parapsychology, using all of these things that we do, even the unexplained. He represented it as a core part of his story. And he used those psychotechnologies as a core part of the technology infrastructure. He's also one of the few sci-fi writers to actually get the analog of the future right. When you read about it, he's actually predicting the formation of OPEC and all the craziness that would happen. And what happens when you yank oil away from a country, which the Saudi Arabians would later do. He predicted the whole thing about 3 years in advance. Demonstrates that every whiz-bang concept and technology has dependencies, and that inherently weakens them. So no matter how cool your sci-fi is, if I don't pay your janitors, well, good luck running your equipment because you're going to be living in shit, basically. I hope you enjoy the smell. So all these things that you rely on, all the whiz-bang toys, there are things that we can target and we can make your life a living hell. And this book is all about exploring those. And he was a libertarian, diehard libertarian, worked for Barry Goldwater, a whole 9 yards, but he was a different one. And that's entirely because of his wife. He relentlessly followed the libertarian ideas to their exact logical conclusion. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't trying to make a political point. He was saying, fine, I believe in these things. Let me just run with it and see where it takes me. And his wife was socialist leaning, and so they worked together. It was actually a beautiful, rare merger of socialism and libertarianism. That would produce a very accessible analog that you can extract pragmatic concepts from. Shoulder of Giants is from Gregory Rawlins. He's a Trinidadian associate computer scientist professor at Indiana University. This book was interesting. I got it from a MySpace forum, and he never published it, which is sad. It proposes conflict theories can be further broken down into behavior to maximize caloric and energy equilibriums. Meaning, instead of saying that conflict theory is the rich versus the poor, let's look at it from energy equilibrium. do we have enough calories to even do a thing? How is that driving individual motivations? What people don't have calories and what are they doing? It's not just money. There is a biological economy going on as well. And the Marxists never liked that interpretation. They still fight it to this day. They don't like the idea of cognitive evolution because it undermines their pretty little class narrative. It doesn't present history as some never-ending sanitization task for neurotics. Like, oh, we got to fix history. Oh, we got to fix it. This was bad and this was bad, and we have to dedicate all of our resources to fix the neuromyths and blah 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 blah. It's like, oh my god, dude, like, come on, give me a break. Like, I'd like a little bit of victory every so often. His publisher actually thought it was too racy because he indirectly points out the mistakes of Marxism, so he was never allowed to publish it. Go figure. You're going to hear a lot of those stories moving forward. And then my book, The Empath, I fell into a state of dire powerlessness, not depression, but powerlessness. And I couldn't stop seeing the future. So I wrote it down. It's like 23. I tried to resolve how AIs evolve. Everything I saw was like, oh, we get supercomputers and quantum computers and all these things. I'm like, I don't know. I don't think that's true. I think if you just collect the emotions instead of data, you're going to change things significantly for all the reasons I've enumerated in previous sessions. If you look at, in terms of pressures, the financial industry has the most motive to build these types of AIs, and they're not going to collect random signals and find correlation. They'll do that. But eventually they're going to settle on collecting emotions and steering those. And well, we're living in it now. It sucks. Instead of waiting for Silicon Valley nerds to figure it out, I proposed using real brains in my book. That got me in a lot of trouble because you shouldn't be doing that. Now, if I was part of the CCP and I proposed that, they wouldn't even blink the eye. They'd have lined up brains for me on tap. But we in the West, we have all of our neuromyths, and we get real pissy about World War II and blah, blah, blah. So I decided to pivot. I said, yeah, no, what? Yeah, fine. Let's use Neanderthal brains. Let's get around it. And that's how we get around it. So we get similar cognition, but none of the legal headache. So you get around the neuromyths there. So now all the over-medicated neurotics now have to somehow launch a political attack about the sanctity of Neanderthals. And when they're done doing that, I'll move the Peking man. And when they're done doing that, I'll go to Australopithecine. And when they're done doing, I got 23 hominids to go through. I can't wait to play that game. Big spooky types got real interested in my technique because I was proposing how to actually do it. It wasn't just sci-fi crap. I was like, here's the things you need to do to actually do it. And they got involved, and I didn't publish my book because that was a time when the CIA was throwing people out of planes still. So I just like being on the ground. And everything you're seeing right now is me making the book real. I didn't publish it because screw it. Let's just make it real. Let's just manifest it for real in this world instead of writing about it. This runner-ups here, Birth of the Mind by Gary Marcus. Fantastic, fantastic. Genetics for computer programmers and information theorists. It explains all these fantastic concepts. It's a little bit dated. It might get a couple things wrong. And Steven Pinker being Steven Pinker, a la Epstein. Yeah, but still, there's some good stuff here going on. Worth a read. And then from Francis Fukuyama, it's a sociology for gene punk advocates. Our post-human future looks a lot into these concepts that I'm bringing up regarding how do you prepare morality and legal systems when different brains are walking amongst us that we can't even begin to comprehend. Like, what do you even do? So this book covers it pretty well from a U.S. policy and academia, DC think tank standpoint. So my Marxism techniques failed. The Marxism community had just been totally hijacked and was worthless. And I pivoted. I decided to expand my horizons and say, okay, maybe I got things wrong. And so now it's time to test it. It's now time to test my new demon hunting framework. So I started a blog called Abusive Oracle. Abusive Oracle was a blog written from the perspective of, excuse me. Pardon me, folks. I'm sorry. I have to check something. My scheduling is a little wonky. Today was super packed. I hate to intervene with a story like this. Everything's going very slow. Forgive me. 10. I might not be able to stay for a Q&A here. Okay, I'll go through this as quick as I can. Abuse of Oracle was a blog written from the perspective of a character in my book, as if he was 20 years old at the time he wrote it. And he was a very nihilistic person, just hated the world, hated everything. And so I embraced that as part of my character development research. And I decided to actually use that persona to actually test some of my research here about hacking morality, because I saw it being done to the Marxists, and I figured that was an important part of the puzzle that I missed. And so Meg Lanker-Simmons was this person who decided to fake a rape charge, and it got all over the place in 2013. And 4chan picked it up, and they're kind of like, what is going on? This is stupid. So I decided to turn this into an example of how to hack morality. The key things here is the experiment laid out a couple points. First one is a fully collective doxing effort to unravel her every connection, which was connected to Bill Ayers and nonviolent communists and university, all kinds of people, think progress, you know, the usual suspects here. We found out all the networks who was driving this type of thing. There were several attempts to rally Reddit, but that was kind of tough. But we did post it in the correct subsection once, and then, you know, massive upvotes, and now we finally got a little bit of virality. Working with that, we persuaded some alumni of the University of Wyoming to distance themselves and not provide more funding to the donations until something's done about this fake rape charge. And I think we were able to get Think Progress to revoke a reward they gave to her, and went after the owner of the sports properties as well. Those are all my suggestions, like finding the dependencies. You find the dependencies and you put pressure on them, and you collapse the support network of a person. And we were not just hacking the left, we were also hacking the right. Conservative blogs took lead and provided the shock troops. The fake support page was quickly found and lunged upon after successfully hacking conservatives' morality. So basically, we were able to turn this into a piece for the conservative blogs who then turn into say, oh, look at this thing that's going on. See, this is what we're warning you against. It's happening. And the left jumped in to fight, and they're like, no, we have to defend the neurotic, right? So we took this tiny little fight and we exploded it across the national space just with these tactics alone. And that was the first pass. That was the first pass of me tinkering with the morality, so I understood exactly how the Marxists got compromised, what it is they were being hacked on. That would lead directly into my theory of fracturing monocultures, where I would take this concept and run with it even further at a bigger scale. I realized that perhaps it wasn't just politics. What if it was communication that was the problem? What if the fact that communication on the internet was just terrible, and it was intentionally terrible, and it was screwing up how people interacted with each other? What type of cultures was that making? Well, if you could take on the internet, I could be anything I want. I could be a 17-year-old Nigerian female, and you wouldn't know it unless I turned on the camera. And that was the internet. So identity was out the window. As a result of identity being out the window, when political pressures come around in the real world and they use the internet to do so, it turns everyone into an identity extremist because there's no way to validate the identity. So everybody has to go out there and say, no, I am this identity. I swear I'm this identity. I am this identity. So everyone becomes an extremist. First actor poll. You all know poll, biggest collection of racists in the world. It's interesting because they are anonymous, and yet, despite that anonymity, they intentionally choose the white nationalist persona. They could be anything they want. They could be, I don't know, Martians. But they're picking in this anonymous space to be the white nationalist personality, identity. That's curious. I wonder why an anonymous forum would do that. Meanwhile, over in pixel-based feminism land over in Tumblr, where identity was tightly measured and tightly metriced, people would turn this into a high conflict game, like a Wall Street trading pit, where they were trying to maximize the amount of tension that they could get. So identity became something that you leverage as opposed to a point of collective action, interestingly enough. we were making predictions about how the feminists would operate and suggesting that they were operating from a perspective of trying to maximize the amount of attention to game their points and get the most likes and the reblogs and all these things. And they would use underhanded tactics to do so. So they would call people racist and sexist without any evidence. The person would be forced to defend them while their team jumped on them. Once you're branded in those things, of course, there's no such thing as salvation. There's no bankruptcy process or jubilee event. Once you're racist for all time. You get to live with it, evidence or not. So that was a very cheap tactic that they still rely on to this day. They will never not rely on it, in fact. And this is used entirely to game social media attention points. It has nothing to do with fixing history or Marxism or anything like that. Since they're trying to achieve points for their status systems, they can conduct mass branding on a fairly consistent basis while finding ways to reduce the amount of effort to do. So they're engaging in an efficiency operation. How do we call even more people racist so we can actually look like the bigger moral paragons that then people come to us and say, oh, you defeated the racists. Oh, here's your points. Here's your social media points. Because they can summon mobs by appealing to identity consolidation, meaning they could say, I'm the best feminist on the internet. They can consolidate the identity around them. They can shout down anything, literally anything. They can get anybody banned. They can get anything removed at any given time. And if you fight them back, they have an infinite array of resources to contest against you, and up to and including in real space, meaning they can just channel civil rights legislation, the ultimate backstop, the 1960s civil rights laws. So they could use that as a backstop. So that emboldens them to push this attack infinitely, because they know that when you get to the Supreme Court, there's going to be a whole level of people who are going to jump in that fight and come to their support. So they're actually emboldened in a very aggressive way with this approach. But I found a problem. I found a tiny little crack. If you can prove that these feminists were white, well, now you have a problem. Because one thing to be feminist. Feminist is easy, but what if you're feminist and black versus feminist and white? Two different feminists. Now, the thing is, they're calling everybody racist, but in the process, what they don't know is that if you're a white feminist and you're out there calling people racist, well, we can flip that on you. And we will flip that on you. And we will poison you. We will poison your own shit. In fact, y'all remember this meme. That's this theory being put into work. We found a way to flip it, and we're going to keep flipping it. Because you want to play this, this unaccountable game where you can call everybody whatever you want just so you can get some social media points. We'll fuck you up in the meme space. That's not free anymore. You can't do that for free anymore. There's prices now. So then a year later, I did my follow-up research. Say, okay, well, let's apply this stuff. It's around 2014 now. Hashtag solidarity is for white women, where I convinced a bunch of 4chan people to pretend to be black feminists. Why? Because solidarity for white women is where they were, it was proof of my theory where black feminists couldn't feed their kids. White feminists were concerned about video game representation. Okay, these are two fundamentally different things, very different weights. So I kind of side with the black feminists here. So I said, let's look at the behavior going on in this hashtag. And whenever a white feminist would speak, black feminists would just smack her down nonstop. So I said, oh, hey guys, go pretend to be black feminists and go attack these white feminists. And they did in droves, like tens of thousands of them. It was the first time they experienced unaccountable power on the internet against their enemies. It was the first time poll was ever successfully turned into a rating force. And that was me. And they kept those accounts because it was too useful. In fact, they would use them again to do the End Father's Day hoax. Whoops. So they use those accounts to say, we should end Father's Day. All fathers are evil. And then Time Magazine picks up the op-ed and they run with it. Oops. Now, I didn't do that one. They did that on their own. You just need to give them a good idea once. And these guys are pretty smart. They'll keep running with it. Even in the wake of that, they managed to start this Not Your Shield business. What is Not Your Shield? Not Your Shield was this, when Gamergate kicked off, these accounts once again fired up. And they were out there saying, you know, not all gamers are racist. And they would use these accounts to demonstrate that black females play video games too. Now, whether that was true or not doesn't matter. What mattered was that we had successfully hacked their algorithm. We had successfully broke their game. And that's why we kept doing it, because they didn't adapt. They didn't fix their game. They still haven't fixed their game. That's why the Karen meme can actually work years after I've set all this stuff up. So it turns out that hashtag was actually compromised by a significant amount of non-white racial identities as well as female identities. The monoculture leveled their sights on active membership, monoculture supporters, and potential monocultures, and unloaded upon them. So what we did is by hitting that tiny little fracture point, we were able to make the entire group of people attack each other. All the feminists attacked each other because they were out there calling everybody racist, and they invoked the big boogeyman of racism. And so I said, fine, there's racists in your midst. And they couldn't get enough of that. So this is the post that starts Not Your Shield around 2014, September. Supplementing Not Your Shield and demand that SJWs stop using you as a shield to deflect genuine criticism. Of course, Zoe Quinn comes out and points out that Not Your Shield is this thing and we need to stop it because they're all sock puppets. They're not real black people. Finally, they actually attack back in a meaningful way. They're like, the internet, everybody can lie. These are actually a bunch of white supremacists from Pole, to the point that this guy and his sock wife who take the stage at the Game Awards, I think it was someone, and no one had any context of why he was doing this except Docs, which was hilarious. But he goes up on stage and says, "Oh, you're all the sock puppets are they're pretending to be black. They're not actually white feminists and blah blah blah." And I'm looking at that and like, oh, they want to go to the media. They want to go to the big boys. They want to escalate this. All right, I can escalate too. So let's escalate. So I did. Bought him 20,000. Now take everything I taught you about alchemy, and one leads to the next chain. 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 Leads to the next. From one domino strike, the whole thing unravels. Just need to know where to hit. That little difference in identity, if you can target the identity neuromyth, the whole thing came crashing down. We're at this stage right now. We're well on our way to this stage. Maybe we'll get here. I don't know. But we're definitely here now. Why did I pick that? Why that? Everyone has opinions on why that is. I want that thing gone, because that's where the subhuman ferals were coming from. In my final analysis, I determined that this is where they're actually coming from. These people were intentionally steering the world, and I don't mean the Illuminati so much so. I mean people at the top of the actual Pareto distribution. Let's just leave the cult stuff out of it. Let's just talk about real power movers and shakers. These were the people who were destroying nations for the sole purpose of enriching themselves. That's my company's logo. What's missing? One domino strike, and I can remove that whole thing. We're here now. We'll see what happens. And that's who I am. Now you know. And that's why it's important to understand the pressures that made the people who made you, so that you can maybe one day have a chance at undoing all of it. And that's it. Thanks. I will have a shorter Q&A session. This is going to suck. I have a 10 o'clock that I have to get to. I am so sorry, everyone. We can schedule a follow-up Q&A if you'd like, but I got a hard 10 o'clock.
Pat, let's give you your 5 minutes back, and we'll do a Q&A another time. Thanks so much for that presentation. Thanks for sharing from your life. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thanks, folks. Sorry, I don't like bailing. I just overbooked. I apologize. Nice. See you, folks.
All right. See you, Pat. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.